No one would buy her, abandoned without clothes at the auction, until an Apache took her in the sun beat down fiercely on the small town, casting long shadows on the cracked earth beneath the wooden stage. Dust swirled in the air, and the heat made everything feel distant, unreal. People gathered in the town square, their faces set with determination, as they waited for the auction to begin. The mood was tense. Today wasn't just any market day, it was the day when women were sold to the highest bidder. Among them stood a young woman barely 18, with pale skin that had seen too many harsh days in the desert. Her long hair, once glossy and full of life, now hung limp, the wind tugging at it like it wanted to rip it away. She stood at the edge of the group, her hands bound loosely in front of her, trying to keep her composure as her heart raced. Her life, like so many others, had become a series of unfortunate events that led her here, to the auction block. The town's auctioneer, a man with a high-pitched voice that echoed around the square, stood proudly at the front. He called out, announcing the start of the auction. One by one, the women were brought to the stage, each with a sad story of survival, each waiting for their fate to be decided by the crowd of men and women gathered before them. They were all desperate for a chance, any chance, to escape the hardships of their past. When it was her turn, the woman's heart sank. She knew what would happen next. The auctioneer's voice was loud, almost mocking, as he introduced her to the crowd. Here we have a young woman, abandoned by her family, left with nothing but the clothes on her back, he called out, his eyes scanning the crowd. Who will offer a bid for her? She's young, and her looks will serve any man well. The words stung, but she had heard them before. The idea of being sold, of having no control over her own life, wasn't new to her. She had been passed from one hand to the next, discarded when she was no longer useful. She had grown numb to it, the humiliation, the empty feeling that came with being reduced to a mere object. But this time, it felt different. She had nothing left to lose. The crowd's eyes roamed over her, some with interest, others with cold indifference. No one moved to raise their hand. No one made a bid. The auctioneer grew impatient, his voice growing sharper with each passing second. Come now. She's a good catch. Someone's bound to want her. Who will give me even a small sum? She tried to stand tall, but it was hard to hold her head up. The heat from the sun pressed down on her, making her feel weak and small. She could hear the murmur of the crowd as they looked her over, their whispers reaching her ears. I've seen her around town. She's nothing but trouble. She's already been discarded. No one's gonna want her. She's worth nothing. Her chest tightened with every word, every judgment cast upon her. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape it all, but she stood frozen. Her hands shook slightly, but she didn't dare look down. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to block out the noise. The auctioneer's voice cut through her thoughts. Last call. Who will take her off my hands? She's just taking up space.
But there was still no response.
Her heart sank, and for a moment she wondered if she would ever escape this place. If no one would buy her, what would happen to her then? Would she be left here, abandoned once again, with nothing but the dirt under her feet? The thought of being discarded, left to roam the streets like an animal, was too much to bear. But as the auctioneer turned to move on to the next woman, something strange happened. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure stepped forward. He was dressed in a simple, worn coat and boots that had clearly seen better days, but there was something about the way he moved that caught her attention. His presence was commanding, though he said nothing. The crowd parted as he walked forward, and for the first time that day she felt a flicker of hope. He stood still for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the stage, meeting hers for a brief second. The air seemed to still around them, and the crowd fell silent, unsure of what was happening. The auctioneer paused, clearly surprised by the man's sudden appearance. He had not seen him around town before, but there was something unmistakable about the way he carried himself, like he belonged to another world, a world beyond the rules of the auction. Without saying a word, the man stepped up to the auctioneer and spoke in a low, steady voice.
I'll take her, the crowd gasped, and the auctioneer blinked in confusion.
What?
You want this one? She's worthless.
No one wants her. The man didn't flinch. I'll take her, he repeated, his voice firm and unwavering. The auctioneer hesitated, but then he shrugged. Well, if you insist. She's yours. He motioned for the woman to be brought down from the stage. For a brief moment, the woman stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Was this real? Was she being sold again, or was this just another part of the nightmare she had been living? But when the man's eyes met hers once more, she saw something there that she hadn't seen before. Something kind. Something that made her think maybe, just maybe, this was her chance. Without a word, she stepped down from the stage and walked toward the man. Her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, but she forced herself to move. The crowd remained silent as the man turned and began to lead her away from the auction block. As they walked away, the woman dared to glance back at the crowd. No one was watching them anymore. The other women had already been sold, and the auction was over. She was the last one left, the one no one wanted, the one who had been abandoned. But now she wasn't alone. The man didn't speak as they walked. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his steps steady and purposeful. She wondered where he was taking her, what he expected from her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were about to change. The man didn't speak a word as they walked away from the auction block. The woman kept her eyes on the ground, her heart racing as her bare feet kicked up the dust with each step. Her mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The auction had ended, but her life hadn't really started. She had been sold, but this time it felt different. She wasn't sure what it was, but something about this man made her feel safe, at least for now. As they walked through the town, people stared. It was a strange feeling, being watched but not cared for. The man's presence seemed to quiet everyone around them, and the woman felt like she was in a world of her own, separated from the rest. His steps were steady, firm, and she had to hurry to keep up with him. She noticed how different he looked from the men who usually roamed the town. His clothes were worn but sturdy, his dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. There was no sign of the arrogance or harshness that seemed to follow the other men. Instead, there was a quiet strength in him, a calmness that was almost unnerving. They didn't go far before the man led her to the edge of town, past the saloons and the small wooden houses that were dotted here and there. The buildings became fewer, and the sounds of the bustling town faded into the background. In their place was the open, dry landscape of the desert. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked earth as the wind swept across the land. She wasn't sure where he was taking her, but she didn't dare ask. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if both of them were lost in their own thoughts. She kept her gaze ahead, trying to get a sense of what was happening. Was she really being taken away from the auction? Or was this just another part of her life being thrown into chaos? She didn't know this man. She didn't know anything about him. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny spark of hope. After what felt like hours, the man stopped in front of a small cabin. It was tucked away behind a cluster of low trees, and the air around it seemed quieter, calmer. He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers. "This is where you'll stay for now," he said, his voice calm but strong. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was simply a statement. She nodded, not knowing what else to do. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a modest room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a few simple chairs. There was a small cot in the corner with a faded blanket. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was warmth. It was a place she could rest without fear of being sold or abandoned again. The woman stepped inside, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. She looked around, taking it all in. The smell of wood and earth filled the air, and for the first time in days, she felt a slight relief in her chest. The man stepped in behind her, closing the door softly. He stood still for a moment, his hands resting at his sides. "You'll need to clean up," he said after a long pause. "There's water outside. Use what you need." She nodded again, unsure of how to respond. She didn't feel like she deserved the kindness he was offering, but she didn't want to refuse it either. She was used to being treated as though she didn't matter, but here, in this small, quiet space, it felt different. Without saying another word, the man turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the cabin. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the door he had just closed. The silence was overwhelming at first, but then it began to feel almost comforting. She was alone, yes, but for the first time, she wasn't abandoned. She wasn't being traded or discarded. She was simply here. After a while, the woman made her way outside. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. The desert stretched out in every direction, the land barren and wild. She walked to the small water barrel beside the cabin, and with trembling hands she filled a tin cup and splashed the cool water on her face. It felt like a small luxury, something so simple yet so deeply needed. As she wiped her face with the back of her hand, she noticed a man watching from a distance. He was standing near the edge of the trees, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He wasn't watching her in the same way the auctioneer had, with eyes that sized her up, judging her. No, he looked at her as if he was waiting for something he hadn't yet seen. There was no expectation in his gaze, just patience. For a moment, she thought about asking him why he had taken her in, why he hadn't just let her go like the others, but the words didn't come. Maybe she didn't need to know just yet. Maybe, for now, all that mattered was that he had given her a chance, something she hadn't had in so long. The man finally stepped forward, walking slowly towards her. When he reached her side, he didn't say anything at first. Instead, he reached down and gently took the tin cup from her hand. Without a word, he led her back to the cabin, where he handed her a simple woolen dress. It wasn't much, but it was something to cover her. She hesitated for a moment, then took it from him, grateful for the small kindness. As the night settled in, they sat in silence around the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound between them. The man didn't ask her about her past, and she didn't offer it. She knew better than to share things with strangers. There were things about her life that no one needed to know. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in ages. The man's quiet presence gave her room to breathe, to just exist without the pressure of survival hanging over her head. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time since she had been abandoned, she was no longer alone, and that, in itself, was enough for now. Days passed, and life with the Apache man became a quiet routine. The woman, still unsure of her place, tried to keep herself busy. The cabin wasn't much, but it was hers now. She spent her mornings outside, collecting firewood and cleaning the area around the cabin. The sun was already high when she set out for the day, the heat of the desert making the air shimmer. It was a hard, lonely place, but she had grown used to the harshness of the land. It was familiar in a way that comforted her. The man whose name she still didn't know would leave early each day, heading into the hills where the wild land met the rugged mountains. She didn't know what he did out there, and he didn't share. He had not once asked her about her past, and she hadn't offered any of the details. There was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't interested in her history. What mattered now was the present, and that was what they both lived in. She had learned to gather food from the land, pulling berries from low bushes and finding wild herbs that had a bitter taste but were necessary for survival. Sometimes she would catch sight of him returning at dusk, carrying a small bundle of meat. The first time she had seen him hunt, she had watched from the distance, her heart racing with awe. He moved through the land as if it were an extension of him, tracking the animals without making a sound. It was a skill she could never master, but she knew she had to try. One evening, as the stars began to fill the sky, he handed her a small, half-filled sack of berries. "For tonight," he said simply, and sat down beside her. She took the berries, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet kindness. She had known people who spoke too much or too little, but this man seemed to understand the power of silence. The kind of silence that didn't ask anything of you. The kind that just existed. As the days stretched into weeks, the woman started to find a rhythm in the life she shared with him. The mornings began with the rising sun, and the evenings with the fading light of day. She began to recognize the sounds of the land, the call of a bird in the distance, the rustle of wind in the trees, the soft crunch of sand beneath her feet. Slowly, she began to feel like she belonged. She even began to trust the man more, though she still didn't know much about him. She had seen him only once since that day at the auction, and that was when he had brought her to the cabin. He was a man of few words, and there were times when she would see him staring into the fire, lost in his thoughts. But there was no fear in his presence, only a calm that made her feel safe. One morning as she was gathering herbs near the cabin, she noticed something strange in the distance. The dust kicked up from several riders on horseback, moving swiftly toward her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly ran back to the cabin. She had seen enough to know that trouble was often just around the corner, and she wasn't ready for it. She grabbed the wooden handle of a small knife she had started carrying. Not for fighting, but for protection. The man was already outside, standing tall, his eyes narrowed as he watched the riders approach. There was no fear in his face, only a sharp focus. The riders came closer, and the woman could hear their voices, but she couldn't make out their words. They stopped a few feet from the cabin, and one of the men spoke, his tone casual but with a hint of curiosity. "You live out here alone?" the man asked, looking at the Apache man. The Apache man didn't answer immediately, his gaze steady. "Not alone," he said simply. The riders exchanged glances. "We've been hearing rumors about a woman. Some say she's been sold. Others say she's been abandoned." "Is that true?" The woman's heart clenched. She stood behind the cabin door, her fingers gripping the knife. She had never felt more exposed than in this moment. The men didn't know her, didn't understand her, but they knew enough to question her place in this world. She stayed quiet, hidden, praying that the Apache man would protect her, even if he didn't know her anything. The man who had spoken seemed to think for a moment. "We've seen her around," he said, his voice now harder. "The auction is no place for a woman like her. She's better off in a town like ours." The Apache man stepped forward then, his presence shifting the atmosphere in the air. "She's not yours to take," he said calmly, his voice steady but filled with an authority that seemed to make the riders think twice. For a moment, there was silence. The wind carried the sounds of the desert in all directions, but the riders stayed still, watching the Apache man. Finally, the leader of the group gave a small nod. "If you say so," he said, his voice not as sure as before. "But we'll be back." The town has eyes, and the auction isn't over just because you took her. With that, the riders turned their horses and rode off into the distance, leaving only a trail of dust behind them. The woman stood there for a moment, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She hadn't realized how much fear she had been holding inside her until it was gone. She glanced up at the Apache man, her protector, and saw that he hadn't moved from his spot, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For the rest of the day, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something dangerous. The encounter left her with a deep sense of unease. But at the same time, she felt a sense of relief, knowing that the Apache man had stood his ground. He hadn't left her, and that alone was enough to make her believe in the safety he had promised her, even if only for a short time. That night, as they sat by the fire, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but her words were clear. "Thank you," she said, looking at him, "for not letting them take me." The man nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes were still focused on the fire, as if nothing had happened. And maybe, to him, nothing had. But to her, it meant everything. The days grew warmer, and the desert around the cabin began to bloom in small patches, the earth offering life where it seemed barren just a few weeks before. The woman had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her new life. Every morning she woke with the sun, her body now used to the hard work and long hours spent outside. It wasn't easy, but she had learned to find beauty in the simplicity of her new routine. The heat of the day was often oppressive, but it was a familiar kind of heat, the kind that came with survival, the kind that told her she was still here. Life with the Apache man had become less of a mystery and more of a quiet understanding. He still didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were always few but meaningful. She had long since stopped asking questions about his past. She wasn't sure if he would answer them anyway, but she wasn't certain she needed to know. In his silence, she felt something deeper. She didn't feel like an outsider anymore. There was no need for explanations. She was a part of something, and that was enough. Her days were spent working, gathering firewood, tending to small gardens of herbs, and searching for food. The land had slowly begun to give her what she needed, and she found herself becoming more skilled at identifying what was safe to eat. The man, when he returned from his daily trips, often brought back meat, sometimes fresh from the hunt. She learned how to prepare it, how to skin and clean the animals with careful hands. It wasn't a skill she had ever imagined she would need, but here, in the quiet of the desert, it was a skill that had become second nature. Despite the simplicity of their lives, the woman couldn't ignore the lingering unease that followed her. The encounter with the riders had left a mark. She had never spoken about it to the man, but every time she saw the dust on the horizon, her heart would quicken. It wasn't just the riders that unsettled her. It was the feeling that no matter how far she ran, her past could still catch up with her. The auction, the shame, the abandonment. They were all things she carried with her, things that she couldn't shake. The man seemed to notice her moments of silence, the times when her gaze would wander to the horizon, where the land met the sky in an endless expanse. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting everything in a soft orange glow, he turned to her. "The land has a way of making you forget," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "It takes what it needs and gives what it can. If you let it, it can make you forget the past." She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could ever forget. The memories of her past were still too fresh, too raw. She had been abandoned, sold, discarded like something that had no value. But here, with the man, there was no judgment. There was no auctioneer to place a value on her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was treated as if she mattered. Still, it wasn't enough to erase the deep-rooted fear that lingered. The thought that someone might come searching for her haunted her at night, keeping her awake with thoughts of what would happen if she were found. The Apache man seemed to understand, though. Without speaking, he started to leave the cabin less frequently. It wasn't that he was avoiding her, but rather that he was trying to give her space. Space to feel safe, to settle into this life without fear of being taken from it. But even as he withdrew a little, she found herself feeling more at home. There was something grounding about the land, about the slow pace of life that it demanded. She had begun to understand the rhythm of the desert, the way the wind shifted through the trees, the way the sun rose and set, bringing life to the earth and then taking it away. It was all part of the cycle, and she was learning to be a part of it, to let go of the past and embrace the present. Then one morning a sound pierced the silence of the cabin. The woman's heart leapt in her chest as the sound of horses' hooves reached her ears. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man was still gone, out in the hills somewhere, and she was alone. The riders. She knew it was them before she even saw them. The thought made her blood run cold, and she scrambled for the knife she had kept hidden beneath her bed. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until the riders emerged from the distance, their figures growing clearer with each passing second. The woman's hand trembled around the knife, but she didn't move. She couldn't move. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, to hide, but she also knew she had to face whatever was coming. The riders stopped at the edge of the cabin, their horses snorting and shifting in place. The woman's pulse raced in her ears, and her grip on the knife tightened. Then, to her surprise, one of the riders dismounted and approached the cabin slowly. He was the same man who had spoken to the Apache man before, the one who had questioned her presence here. "We're looking for a woman," he said, his voice rough. "One who was sold, one who belongs in the town." His eyes scanned the cabin, settling on her. She stood tall, trying not to show how terrified she was, but her legs felt weak beneath her. "Is she here?" the rider asked again, his voice demanding. The woman didn't speak. Her mouth was dry, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could answer, she heard the sound of hooves approaching from behind the riders. The Apache man appeared. His dark eyes locked onto the group with the intensity of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "They're not your concern," he said simply, his voice calm but forceful. The rider who had spoken to her looked at the Apache man, his posture tense but hesitant. He seemed to measure the strength in the man's words before responding. "You'll have to answer for this," the rider warned, his voice laced with threat. "You can't keep her out here forever." The Apache man didn't flinch. "She's not yours to take," he replied, his voice low and firm. The riders didn't say another word. They turned their horses and rode off, leaving nothing but the sound of their departure. The woman watched them leave, her heart still racing, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was learning what it meant to be free. Free from fear, free from judgment. As the Apache man turned to walk back to the cabin, he glanced at her, his eyes softer than they had been before. "The land keeps what's here," he said quietly, "and it doesn't let go easily." The woman nodded, taking in the weight of his words. She didn't know what the future held, but for now she knew one thing. She wasn't going anywhere. Not unless she wanted to. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next as the woman settled further into her new life. She had come to understand the rhythm of the desert and the simple ways of the Apache man who had saved her. Her days were filled with work, but it wasn't a life of drudgery, it was one of survival, and she found herself growing stronger with each passing day. The man, whose name she still hadn't learned, had become her protector, but more than that, he had become her constant. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't expect her to be someone she wasn't. He simply allowed her to be, and for the first time in a long time she felt like she belonged. But even in this new life, the shadow of her past lingered. The memories of the auction, of being sold, of being abandoned, they didn't fade. They were with her in quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small cabin. She thought about the people she had known before, the ones who had used her, treated her as if she were less than human. Sometimes she wondered what had happened to them, and sometimes she wished she could forget them altogether. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase those memories. Yet, there was something different about being here, with the Apache man. In the beginning, she had seen herself as nothing more than a burden, someone who had been taken in out of some misplaced sense of pity. But slowly, over time, she realized that the man wasn't helping her because he felt sorry for her. He was helping her because, in his way, he saw her as an equal. He never made her feel less than him. He never looked at her like she was broken or used. She had come to understand that he saw her as a person who had survived, someone with strength, and that gave her a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. One morning the sun was barely rising, casting soft light over the desert, when the woman noticed something different. The air was still, but there was a certain tension in it, something that felt unfamiliar. She was gathering herbs by the small stream that ran near the cabin when she heard the sound of hooves in the distance. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but the sound grew louder. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly dropped the basket she had been holding. The riders. They were back. She rushed back to the cabin, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what she would do if they returned. They had come so close to taking her before, and she feared they might try again. The Apache man was nowhere to be seen, but she knew he was probably out in the hills doing his usual rounds. She grabbed the knife she had kept close by and took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was coming. The riders were drawing nearer now, their figures emerging from the haze of the desert. There were 3 of them this time, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. The woman stood frozen, her grip on the knife tightening. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. She felt trapped. The riders came to a stop just outside the cabin, their horses snorting and shifting. The woman stepped out onto the porch, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to say, but she knew she couldn't let them think she was defenseless. The leader of the group dismounted first, his boots making a soft thud as he hit the ground. His eyes scanned the cabin, and then they landed on her. "We've been looking for you," he said, his voice flat but firm. "You don't belong here. You belong back in town. Come with us, and we'll make sure you're taken care of." The woman stood tall, trying to hide the fear that was still coursing through her veins. She had heard these words before. People telling her where she belonged, telling her what to do with her life. But she wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't going to let them control her. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady though it trembled slightly. The rider seemed to pause as if unsure of how to respond. "You can't stay out here forever," he said after a moment. "The town needs you." "You'll be safer there." The woman shook her head, her resolve strengthening with each word he spoke. "I'm safer here," she said, her voice now firmer. "I don't belong in your town. I belong here, with the land." The rider's face darkened, and he took a step closer. "You're a fool if you think this will last. No one wants you out here, not for long." Just as the rider was about to step forward again, the Apache man appeared from behind the trees. He walked with a quiet confidence, his presence unmistakable. The riders tensed, their hands going to their weapons, but the man didn't seem to notice. He stopped just a few feet from the group, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. "This woman is under my protection," the Apache man said calmly, his voice low but filled with authority. "You'll leave now, and you'll leave her be." The riders exchanged nervous glances, but the leader didn't back down. "We're not leaving without her. She doesn't belong to you." The Apache man's eyes flicked over to the woman, then back to the riders. "She belongs to no one but herself," he said quietly. "And you will respect that." For a moment there was silence. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of the desert, then, slowly, the leader of the riders seemed to think it over. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but we'll be back. You can't keep her here forever." With that, they turned and rode off, disappearing into the dust, leaving nothing behind but the quiet of the desert. The woman stood still, her heart still racing. But as the last of the riders faded into the distance, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could live in fear of being found, of being taken away from the only place she had come to call home. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going anywhere. The Apache man turned to her, his face softening. "You did well," he said quietly. The woman looked up at him, surprised by his praise. "I didn't do anything," she said, shaking her head. "I was just afraid." He nodded slowly, his eyes kind. "Fear is something we all carry," he said, "but you've learned to face it. That's what matters." For the first time in a long time, the woman smiled, a small but genuine smile. She wasn't the same person who had been abandoned at the auction, the one who had been sold like an object. She was someone else now, someone stronger. Someone who had fought for her right to be free. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of red and gold, the woman stood beside the Apache man, watching the world around her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. And that was enough.